Dorothy Henderson's arthritic hands froze mid-reach for her morning coffee, the familiar scratch at her cabin door stopping her heart cold. No animal had visited her isolated Fairbanks property in the 3 lonely years since Frank's death, especially not one whimpering like a human child in distress. The sound wasn't coming from a dog or wolf. Through the frosted window, she glimpsed something impossible. A small, bare cub, its fur crystallized with ice, pawing desperately at her door with an almost human urgency. Her coffee mug crashed to the kitchen floor, ceramic fragments scattering as Dorothy's breath caught in her throat. The cub's dark eyes met hers through the glass, intelligent, pleading, filled with a desperate recognition that made her knees buckle against the counter. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered, remembering Frank's cryptic deathbed words about watching over what's buried in the cold. Had her late husband's secrets finally clawed their way to her doorstep? And what would answering that desperate plea cost the last remnants of her carefully guarded heart? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 years of widowhood had taught Dorothy Henderson that loneliness could kill faster than any disease. At 68, she'd spent 4 decades as a pediatric nurse at Fairbanks General, pouring her maternal instincts into other people's children after losing her own premature baby 45 years ago. When Frank died in that senseless car accident, she'd retreated to their remote cabin, convinced her usefulness had died with him. The silence had become unbearable. Her son Jim, a high-powered corporate lawyer in Denver, called twice a month with the same guilt-laden conversation about assisted living facilities. "Mom, you're too isolated out there. What if something happens?" His concern felt more like obligation than love, wrapped in legal arguments about her safety and his liability. Jim had inherited Frank's methodical mind, but none of his warmth, treating Dorothy's independence like a case to be solved rather than a choice to be respected. Dorothy's saving grace was her 16-year-old granddaughter, Emma, who'd been living with her since Jim's messy divorce. The girl had arrived sullen and broken, mourning her grandfather's death with a depth that worried Dorothy. Emma barely spoke those first months, spending hours staring out at the endless Alaskan wilderness with hollow eyes that reminded Dorothy too much of her own reflection. Frank had been Emma's anchor. While Jim buried himself in work, Frank had taught Emma to fish, shown her the constellations, listened to her teenage heartbreaks with patient understanding. His death had left both females adrift in their grief, circling each other like wounded satellites, too proud to admit how desperately they needed connection. The cabin itself held 40 years of memories in its log walls. Frank had built it with his own hands, every room filled with his gentle presence. The basement workshop where he'd spent countless hours on mysterious projects remained locked. Dorothy couldn't bear to face whatever dreams he'd left unfinished down there. His coffee cup still sat in the sink most mornings, a habit she couldn't break. Money wasn't the issue. Frank's government pension and Dorothy's nursing retirement provided comfortable stability. But comfort meant nothing when every sunrise felt like another day to endure, rather than embrace. She'd begun having dangerous thoughts lately, wondering if Frank was waiting for her somewhere beyond the pain. Emma sensed her grandmother's despair, though neither acknowledged it directly. They moved through their daily routines like ghosts haunting their own lives, sharing meals in comfortable silence, watching old movies without really seeing them. Both were drowning in their separate sorrows, unaware that salvation might come scratching at their door on a frozen October morning, desperate and half-dead, but carrying more hope than either dared imagine. Dorothy's hands trembled as she unlocked the front door, her heart hammering against her ribs. The October air bit through her flannel nightgown, but nothing could have prepared her for what lay crumpled on her wooden porch. The bear cub was smaller than she'd expected, maybe 30 pounds, its thick fur matted with ice crystals that sparkled in the morning light. But it was the creature's eyes that stopped her breath. Dark, intelligent, and filled with a very human desperation. "Oh, sweet baby," Dorothy whispered, her nursing instincts overriding 3 years of careful emotional distance. The cub lifted its head weakly, making soft mewling sounds that tugged at her heart. Ice had formed around its mouth and paws, and she could see the animal was hypothermic, its breathing shallow and rapid. Emma appeared behind her in pajamas, drawn by her grandmother's gasp. "Grandma, what is... oh my God." The teenager's voice cracked with the first genuine emotion Dorothy had heard from her in months. "Is it dying?" "Not if I can help it." Dorothy's voice carried the authority of 4 decades spent saving lives. "Emma, get every towel from the linen closet. Heat some milk on the stove, not too hot, and call Dr. Martinez at the veterinary clinic." They worked together with desperate efficiency, wrapping the cub in warm towels and carrying it to the living room near the fireplace. Dorothy had delivered enough premature babies to recognize the signs of severe hypothermia, and this little one was fighting for every breath. The cub's body temperature was dangerously low, its pulse weak and thready. "The vet's office won't open for another hour," Emma reported, her voice tight with worry. She knelt beside the makeshift bed they'd created, one hand hovering protectively over the cub. "Grandma, look at its paws!" Dorothy examined the small creature more closely, her trained eye catching details that made her frown. The paw structure was unusual, almost hand-like in its dexterity. The cub's facial features were different too, more refined than the black bears common to their area, with a shorter snout and larger skull that suggested unusual intelligence. "Where did you come from, little one?" Dorothy murmured, gently massaging the cub's limbs to improve circulation. The animal's response surprised her. It seemed to understand her tone, relaxing under her touch with a soft sigh that sounded almost human. As the morning wore on, something miraculous happened. The cub began to respond to their care, its breathing deepening, body temperature gradually rising. But more remarkable was its behavior. When Dorothy offered warmed milk from a bottle, the cub grasped it with both paws like a human baby, maintaining eye contact throughout the feeding. When Emma spoke softly, the animal turned its head toward her voice with obvious comprehension. "It understands us," Emma whispered in wonder. For the first time since Frank's death, genuine joy lit up her face. "Grandma, it actually understands what we're saying." Dorothy felt a flutter of something she'd thought died with Frank. Hope, purpose, the maternal pull that had defined her life. This wasn't just any animal that had wandered onto their property. Something about this cub felt significant, even mystical, as if Frank had somehow sent them exactly what they needed. By afternoon, the cub was strong enough to explore the living room, though it never strayed far from Dorothy and Emma. It seemed fascinated by simple objects, light switches, door handles, Emma's smartphone, studying them with an intensity that made Dorothy's skin prickle with recognition. She'd seen that same intellectual curiosity in Frank's eyes when he worked on his mysterious basement projects. "We need to name him," Emma announced, her voice stronger than it had been in months. The cub had curled up between them on the couch, one paw resting on Emma's lap, the other touching Dorothy's hand. "What about Aurora? Like the northern lights Grandpa used to show us?" "Aurora," Dorothy repeated softly, testing the name. The cub lifted its head at the sound, meeting her gaze with those impossibly intelligent dark eyes. "I think she likes it." As evening approached, Aurora displayed behaviors that defied everything Dorothy knew about wild animals. The cub seemed to understand the concept of privacy, waiting outside the bathroom door rather than following them in. She learned to open cabinet doors by watching Dorothy once, and most unnervingly, she appeared to recognize her own reflection in the mirror, not with confusion, but with what looked like self-awareness. "Grandma," Emma said quietly as they prepared for bed. Aurora curled between them on the couch like a living bridge connecting their hearts. "Do you think Grandpa would have wanted us to keep her?" Dorothy looked down at the sleeping cub, one small paw still clutching her finger with surprising strength. For the first time in 3 years, the cabin didn't feel like a tomb filled with memories. It felt like home again, warm with purpose and the precious sound of Emma's laughter. "I think," Dorothy said carefully, "your grandpa would want us to do whatever makes us feel alive again." 3 weeks into October, Dorothy began to notice changes that defied everything she thought she knew about wild animals. Aurora had grown stronger, her thick coat now lustrous and healthy, but it was the bear's behavior that left Dorothy questioning her own sanity. The cub had learned to open doors by turning handles, not by clawing or forcing them. She waited patiently during meals, never begging, and seemed to understand the concept of bedtime, curling up on her blanket when Dorothy said good night. But it was Aurora's effect on Emma that truly stunned Dorothy. Her granddaughter, who had barely spoken above a whisper for months, now chattered constantly to the bear, sharing secrets and fears she'd never voiced aloud. Emma's pallor had improved, the dark circles under her eyes fading, and most remarkably, the girl had begun eating regular meals again after months of picking at her food. "She's like a therapy animal," Emma explained one morning, brushing Aurora's fur while the cub sat perfectly still, eyes closed in contentment. "But better. She really listens, Grandma. I know that sounds crazy, but when I talk to her, it's like she understands not just the words, but what I'm feeling inside." Dorothy watched from the kitchen doorway, her nurse's instincts prickling. Emma was right. Aurora did seem to understand human emotion with uncanny accuracy. When Dorothy felt waves of grief over Frank's absence, Aurora would appear at her side, pressing her warm body against Dorothy's legs until the sadness passed. When Emma cried over her parents' divorce, Aurora would rest her massive head on the girl's lap, making soft, whimpering sounds of comfort. The first real shock came when Dr. Sarah Chen arrived from the University of Alaska for what Dorothy had described as a routine wildlife consultation. Dr. Chen, an old friend from Frank's government research days, had agreed to examine Aurora discreetly, avoiding the bureaucratic red tape that would come with official wildlife services. "Dorothy, I need you to prepare yourself," Dr. Chen said quietly after her initial examination, her voice tight with disbelief. "This isn't a normal black bear cub. The bone structure, skull capacity, even the neural pathways I can detect through basic neurological testing. Everything suggests this animal has cognitive abilities far beyond typical bear intelligence." "What are you saying, Sarah?" "I'm saying Aurora might be the most intelligent non-human animal I've ever encountered. Her problem-solving skills, emotional responses, even the way she seems to anticipate your needs. It's unprecedented." Dr. Chen paused, studying Aurora with scientific fascination. "Dorothy, where exactly did you find her?" The question Dorothy had been dreading hung in the air. She'd never told anyone about the strange equipment sounds she'd heard from Frank's basement workshop in the days before Aurora's arrival. The electrical humming that had kept her awake, followed by an odd silence. Then Aurora's appearance the next morning. Frank's basement had been his private domain for 40 years, filled with projects he'd never fully explained, government research he'd called classified but harmless. "She just appeared on my porch," Dorothy said carefully, not entirely lying. That evening, after Dr. Chen left with promises to run discreet blood work, Dorothy made a decision that had been weighing on her for weeks. She retrieved Frank's workshop keys from his desk drawer, hands trembling as she approached the basement door she hadn't opened since his death. The basement workshop was exactly as Frank had left it. Cluttered workbenches, government-issued computers that still hummed quietly, and strange equipment Dorothy didn't recognize. But in the corner sat something that made her blood run cold. A large, sophisticated freezer unit, now dark and silent, its door slightly ajar. Frost still clung to its interior walls, and on the floor nearby lay scattered papers covered in Frank's careful handwriting. Dorothy's heart hammered as she read fragments of Frank's notes. Subject shows remarkable adaptation to preservation process. Intelligence levels exceed all projections. Government authorization terminated, but subject cannot be destroyed. Dorothy must never know until... The papers were water-damaged and incomplete, but one phrase appeared repeatedly: Project Gatekeeper. Frank had been involved in some kind of government research involving animal preservation and intelligence enhancement. Aurora wasn't just an unusually smart bear. She was the product of Frank's secret work, a project he'd apparently continued even after official funding ended. Emma's voice from upstairs broke Dorothy's horrified reverie.
"Grandma! Aurora's acting weird!"
Dorothy rushed upstairs to find Aurora standing at the living room window, every muscle tense, making low warning sounds Dorothy had never heard before. Outside, 3 black SUVs had pulled into their driveway, men in dark suits emerging with official-looking briefcases. "Mrs. Henderson?" The lead man flashed government credentials. "I'm Agent Williams, Department of Interior Wildlife Division. We've received reports about an unusual animal on your property. We need to examine any wildlife you may be harboring." Dorothy's mouth went dry. Someone had reported Aurora? Dr. Chen? No, Sarah would never betray her trust. But somehow, word had gotten out about the extraordinary bear cub living in their home. "I don't know what you're talking about," Dorothy lied, even as Aurora pressed against her legs, sensing her distress. "Ma'am, we have reason to believe you're in possession of a genetically unusual specimen that may pose a public health risk. We need to examine the animal immediately and potentially relocate it to a secure research facility." Behind Agent Williams, Dorothy spotted a familiar face that made her stomach clench. Dr. Richard Blackwood, CEO of PharmaCorp Industries. She recognized him from news articles about pharmaceutical breakthroughs, a man who'd built an empire on medical innovations. His presence here couldn't be coincidental. "Emma, take Aurora to your room," Dorothy said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. "Mrs. Henderson." Dr. Blackwood stepped forward with practiced sympathy. "I understand your attachment to the animal, but you must understand, if this creature possesses the unique biological properties we believe it does, it could hold the key to saving countless human lives. Surely you, as a former nurse, can appreciate the greater good here." The phrase, "greater good," hung in the air like a threat. Dorothy looked down at Aurora, who gazed back with those impossibly intelligent eyes, and realized their peaceful sanctuary was about to become a battlefield. Dorothy stood her ground on the front porch, every maternal instinct screaming at her to protect Aurora from the men who spoke of greater good with the cold calculation of people who'd never loved anything more than their own ambitions. Behind her, she could hear Emma's soft voice reassuring Aurora in the bedroom, the girl's courage stronger than her father had ever given her credit for. "Gentlemen, this is private property," Dorothy said firmly, channeling 40 years of authority gained from facing down anxious parents and demanding hospital administrators. "You have no warrant, no legal standing here. I suggest you leave." Dr. Blackwood stepped forward with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Henderson, I understand your protective instincts, but let me share something with you." He pulled out his phone, showing her a photograph of a young girl in a hospital bed, bald from chemotherapy, her small face gaunt with suffering. "This is Katie, my daughter. She's 10 years old and has been fighting leukemia for 2 years. The conventional treatments aren't working anymore." Dorothy's nurse's heart clenched at the image. recognizing the particular pallor and hollow eyes of a child losing the battle against cancer. She'd held too many hands of parents facing this nightmare, had delivered too many condolences to families who'd exhausted all hope. Dr. Chen's preliminary blood work on your pet shows proteins that could revolutionize cancer treatment, Blackwood continued, his voice thick with emotion. Mrs. Henderson, Aurora could save Katie. She could save thousands of children like Katie. How can you justify keeping her here when she could be saving lives? The moral weight of his words hit Dorothy like a physical blow. Emma appeared in the doorway behind her, Aurora at her side, both girl and bear sensing the tension that crackled through the autumn air. Emma looked fragile in the morning light, and Dorothy noticed with a nurse's trained eye that her granddaughter seemed more tired lately, more pale than even grief could explain. "You're asking me to give up the first joy we've had in 3 years," Dorothy said quietly. "Aurora isn't just an animal to us. She's family." "Family?" Agent Williams interjected with bureaucratic impatience. "Ma'am, we're talking about a wild animal that's been illegally kept as a pet. There are federal regulations about wildlife conservation, public safety protocols." "She's not wild," Emma interrupted, stepping forward with surprising courage. "Aurora understands us. She comforts us when we're sad. She knows when we need her. She's more human than half the people I know." Dr. Blackwood's eyes sharpened as he studied Emma, taking in her pallor and the way Aurora pressed protectively against her legs. "Young lady, when was the last time you had a complete medical examination?" "You look like you might be anemic." Dorothy's blood chilled. She'd been so focused on her own grief that she'd attributed Emma's pallor to depression, her fatigue to the emotional trauma of losing Frank and watching her parents divorce. But looking at Emma now with clinical eyes, Dorothy saw signs she'd been trained to recognize, the subtle symptoms of something far more serious than sadness. "Emma's fine," Dorothy said quickly, but doubt crept into her voice. "Mrs. Henderson?" Dr. Blackwood pressed his advantage. "I'm not just a pharmaceutical executive. I'm a father who's watched his child suffer. I can arrange for Emma to receive the best medical care available, comprehensive testing, whatever she needs. All I ask in return is the opportunity to study Aurora's blood, to understand what makes her special." "You want to take her away?" Emma said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You want to put her in a lab?" "We want to help her help others," Agent Williams corrected. "The animal would be well cared for at our research facility. She'd contribute to medical breakthroughs that could change the world." Dorothy felt the walls of her peaceful sanctuary crumbling around her. The life she'd rebuilt with Emma and Aurora, the purpose she'd rediscovered, the healing they'd all found together. Everything balanced on the edge of a decision that felt impossible to make. That evening, after the government men had left with promises to return with proper documentation, Dorothy sat in Frank's workshop reading through more of his scattered notes. The picture that emerged made her stomach clench with dread. Project Gatekeeper hadn't been about simple animal research. It had been about creating enhanced specimens with unique biological properties specifically for medical research. Aurora was designed to be sacrificed for the greater good. Frank's final entries revealed his growing moral crisis. "Cannot proceed with termination protocol," one note read. Subject shows emotional capacity, forms attachments, experiences what can only be called love. Dorothy lost our baby. How can I create another creature destined for the laboratory table? Another entry, dated just days before his death. Have suspended Aurora in preservation chamber. If something happens to me, she will eventually wake. Dorothy will find her. Maybe Dorothy can give her the life I couldn't, the life she deserves." Dorothy's hands shook as she read Frank's confession. Her husband had essentially left her a living legacy, a creature he'd saved from a fate worse than death by giving her the chance for love and family. Aurora hadn't wandered onto their property by accident. She was Frank's final gift, his attempt to heal the wounds that had haunted their marriage for 45 years. But now that gift was threatened by the very system Frank had tried to escape. The next morning brought more complications. Jim arrived from Denver, his expensive suit and grim expression announcing his intentions before he spoke a word. He'd driven through the night after receiving calls from both Dr. Blackwood and the federal agents, and his lawyer's mind had already calculated the legal ramifications of harboring what the government classified as experimental biological material. "Mom, what the hell have you gotten yourself into?" Jim demanded, not even acknowledging Emma's presence or noticing how Aurora positioned herself protectively between him and the two women. "Do you have any idea what kind of liability you're facing? Federal violations, public endangerment charges, they could seize the house, freeze your assets." "Good morning to you too, son," Dorothy replied with acid sweetness. "I see your concern for our well-being is as warm as always. Don't start with me, Mom. I've been fielding calls from reporters, federal agents, and corporate lawyers all night. This has turned into a media circus, and you're at the center of it." Jim pulled out his phone, showing her news headlines. "Miracle Bear Could Hold Cancer Cure. Alaska Grandmother Hoards Medical Breakthrough. Federal Government Battles Widow Over Wonder Animal." Emma gasped at the headlines, understanding for the first time how big this had become. "Dad, they want to kill Aurora. They want to cut her up and study her like she's just a science experiment." "Emma, sometimes difficult decisions have to be made for the greater good," Jim said, echoing Dr. Blackwood's words with lawyerly precision. "If this animal can save lives—" "Her name is Aurora," Emma interrupted fiercely. "And she's not just an animal, she's our family. She's a bear, Emma. A genetically modified research specimen that should never have been in civilian hands in the first place." Jim's voice rose with frustration. "Mom, I've already contacted Sunset Manor. They have an opening next week." "You can't handle this kind of stress at your age, especially with these legal complications." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Jim was using the Aurora situation as justification to force Dorothy into assisted living, solving what he saw as the problem of his aging, stubborn mother. Emma would return to Denver with him. Aurora would go to the research facility, and Dorothy would spend her remaining years in institutional care. "Over my dead body," Dorothy said quietly, her voice carrying 40 years of steel forged in hospital corridors where life and death decisions were made every day. Aurora, as if sensing the family conflict, moved to Dorothy's side and gently took her hand with careful claws, a gesture so human it made Jim step back in obvious discomfort. "See," Emma said triumphantly, "she knows we're talking about her." "She knows Dad wants to send her away." That night, as Dorothy tucked Emma into bed with Aurora curled at the girl's feet like a furry guardian, her granddaughter asked the question that had been haunting them both. "Grandma, what if they're right? What if Aurora really could save all those sick kids?" Dorothy smoothed Emma's hair, noting again how thin it seemed, how fragile her granddaughter looked in the lamplight. "Baby girl, wanting to help people is never wrong, but sacrificing someone you love without their consent, that's not heroism. That's just fear dressed up as virtue." Outside, snow began to fall, the first of the season, and Dorothy wondered if their time was running out faster than the approaching winter. The federal courthouse in Anchorage buzzed with an energy Dorothy had never experienced, cameras flashing as reporters shouted questions about the miracle bear and the selfish grandmother who refused to share her with the world. Dorothy gripped Emma's hand tightly as they pushed through the crowd, Aurora's transport cage covered with blankets to shield her from the chaos. The bear had been surprisingly calm during the journey, as if she understood the gravity of what was happening. Inside the courtroom, Dorothy felt the weight of public scrutiny bearing down like a physical force. The gallery was packed with cancer families holding photos of their sick children, pharmaceutical executives in expensive suits, animal rights activists with protest signs, and media representatives documenting every moment. Judge Patricia Morrison, a stern woman in her 60s, called for order as the proceedings began. Dr. Blackwood took the witness stand first, his testimony polished and devastating. He spoke with a father's anguish about watching Katie deteriorate, about sleepless nights researching experimental treatments, about the hope that Aurora represented for countless families facing similar nightmares. When he displayed enlarged photographs of children in cancer wards, several jury members wiped away tears. "Your Honor," Blackwood said, his voice breaking with practiced emotion, "Aurora's blood contains unique proteins that could revolutionize cancer treatment. Every day we delay means children die who could be saved." Mrs. Henderson's attachment to this animal, while understandable, cannot outweigh the greater good of humanity. Dorothy watched the jury's faces, seeing sympathy shift toward Blackwood's argument. The moral mathematics seemed simple. One animal's life versus thousands of human lives. How could any reasonable person choose the bear? PharmaCorp's chief scientist, Dr. Martinez, explained the research potential in terms that made Aurora sound like a living pharmacy. The compounds in this specimen's blood show remarkable anti-tumor properties. With proper study, we could synthesize these proteins and mass-produce treatments within 18 months. We estimate this could save 40,000 lives in the first year alone. When Dorothy's lawyer, a young public defender named Sarah Walsh, cross-examined Dr. Martinez, her questions revealed uncomfortable truths about pharmaceutical research. "Dr. Martinez, how many animal subjects has PharmaCorp used in research over the past decade?" "That information is proprietary. Would you say it's in the thousands, tens of thousands?" "Animal research is necessary for medical advancement." "And how many of those animals survived your research protocols?" Dr. Martinez shifted uncomfortably. "The survival rate varies depending on the research parameters, meaning most of them died in your laboratories." The courtroom stirred as the implications settled. Aurora wouldn't be the first animal to die for PharmaCorp's research, just the most publicized. During the lunch recess, Dorothy found herself cornered by cancer families in the courthouse hallway. A woman named Maria, whose 7-year-old son had acute lymphoblastic leukemia, grabbed Dorothy's hands with desperate strength. "Please," Maria begged, tears streaming down her face. "My boy Diego has maybe 3 months left. The doctors say he's too weak for more chemotherapy. Aurora could save him. How can you look at this picture of my baby and say no?" Dorothy stared at the photograph of a small boy with kind eyes and a brave smile, his hospital gown dwarfing his frail body. Her nursing instincts screamed at her to help, to do whatever it took to save this child and hundreds like him. But when she looked across the hallway at Emma sitting with Aurora, both girl and bear looking lost and frightened, Dorothy felt her resolve strengthen. "I'm sorry," Dorothy said quietly. "I'm so sorry for what you're going through, but sacrificing Aurora won't bring back what your son has lost. It will just create more loss." Maria's face hardened with anger. "You're a selfish old woman. You'd rather play house with a bear than save dying children." The afternoon session brought Dorothy to the witness stand, where she faced a hostile prosecutor determined to paint her as a delusional elderly woman putting her fantasies above human welfare. Under cross-examination, Dorothy struggled to articulate why Aurora's life mattered as much as the children she could potentially save. "Mrs. Henderson," the prosecutor pressed, "you spent 4 decades as a pediatric nurse. How many children did you help save during your career?" "Hundreds. Maybe thousands. And if you could save thousands more by making one difficult decision, Wouldn't that be consistent with your life's work? Dorothy felt the trap closing around her. It would be consistent with my profession, maybe, but not with my heart. Your heart, Mrs. Henderson. We're talking about scientific fact, medical breakthrough, not sentiment. Science without compassion isn't medicine, it's butchery, Dorothy replied, drawing murmurs from the gallery. Aurora isn't just genetic material. She's a living being capable of love, fear, joy, and suffering. The moment we decide her life is worth less than human lives, we become the very thing we claim to be fighting against. When Emma took the stand, her testimony brought a different perspective to the courtroom drama. At 16, she spoke with a maturity that surprised even Dorothy, describing how Aurora had saved her from the depression that had nearly consumed her after Frank's death. Aurora didn't just comfort me, Emma explained to the hushed courtroom. She gave me a reason to wake up every morning. After my grandfather died, I didn't want to live anymore. I felt like I was drowning in sadness and nobody understood, but Aurora did. She would sit with me when I cried, and somehow she made the pain bearable. The prosecutor, perhaps sensing weakness, pushed harder than necessary. Miss Henderson, don't you think you're being selfish? Children are dying while you play with your pet bear. Emma's composure cracked, tears flowing as she looked at Aurora in her transport cage. Aurora isn't my pet. She's my friend, my best friend. And if loving someone and not wanting them to die makes me selfish, then I guess I'm selfish. The courtroom erupted in emotional responses, some supportive, others angry. Judge Morrison called for order, but Dorothy could see that Emma's raw honesty had affected even the hardest hearts in the room. Dr. Blackwood's second appearance on the witness stand revealed more of his desperation. He spoke about Katie's latest setbacks, her increasing resistance to treatment, the narrowing window of hope. But under questioning from Dorothy's lawyer, cracks appeared in his perfect facade. Dr. Blackwood, exactly what happened to the animals in the original Project Gatekeeper research? That's classified government research. Your Honor, this directly relates to Aurora's welfare, Sarah Walsh pressed. The jury deserves to know what research means in practical terms. Judge Morrison ordered Blackwood to answer. His response chilled the courtroom. The original specimens. They didn't survive the extraction process. The compounds we needed were too integrated into their cellular structure. Full extraction required complete biological sampling. You mean they died? They were sacrificed for the advancement of medical science. And Aurora would meet the same fate? Blackwood's silence spoke volumes. The prosecution's final witness was Jim Henderson, Dorothy's own son, whose testimony felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than any legal argument. Dressed in his most expensive suit, Jim spoke with clinical detachment about his mother's declining mental capacity, her inability to make rational decisions, the danger she posed to herself and others by harboring Aurora. My mother is 68 years old and has been living in isolation since my father's death, Jim testified, avoiding Dorothy's eyes. She's clearly formed an unhealthy attachment to this animal as a replacement for human companionship. Her judgment is compromised by grief and loneliness. She needs professional care, not the responsibility of making decisions that affect public health. Dorothy watched her son systematically destroy her credibility, using her grief as evidence of mental incompetence, her love for Aurora as proof of delusion. Jim presented documents for Sunset Manor, medical opinions about elderly depression, legal arguments for conservatorship that would strip Dorothy of her rights and place Aurora under government control. Mr. Henderson, Sarah Walsh challenged during cross-examination, when did you last spend meaningful time with your mother? Jim shifted uncomfortably. I visit when I can. My work requires. When, specifically, this year? I called her for her birthday. A phone call. And before that? Christmas. I sent a card. A card? Mr. Henderson, how can you evaluate your mother's mental capacity based on phone calls and greeting cards? The question hung in the air, exposing Jim's neglect for what it was. But the damage was done. The jury had heard a son testify against his mother, clinical evidence that Dorothy was an unstable elderly woman making irrational decisions. As the day ended, Dorothy sat in her hotel room with Emma and Aurora, all three of them exhausted by the emotional battlefield the courtroom had become. Aurora seemed to sense the gravity of their situation, staying close to both humans, offering comfort with gentle touches of her massive paws. "Grandma," Emma said quietly, "what if we lose tomorrow?" Dorothy pulled her granddaughter close, one hand resting on Aurora's thick fur. Through the hotel window, she could see protesters on both sides. Save Aurora signs competing with Save the Children banners. The moral complexity of their situation had divided the entire country, turning their family crisis into a national debate. "Baby girl, sometimes doing the right thing doesn't guarantee the outcome you want," Dorothy said. "But it guarantees you can live with yourself afterward." Outside, snow continued to fall on Anchorage, and Dorothy wondered if this would be their last night together as a family. Tomorrow, Judge Morrison would decide Aurora's fate, and with it, the future of the only love Dorothy had left in the world. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent her career saving lives, and now she was fighting to save the life that had saved her. Judge Morrison's verdict came down like a gavel strike to Dorothy's heart. While I sympathize with Mrs. Henderson's emotional attachment to Aurora, the court must consider the greater good of society. The potential medical benefits outweigh individual sentiment. Custody of the specimen will be transferred to Pharmacorp Industries for research purposes, effective immediately. The courtroom exploded in cheers and protests, but Dorothy heard only the sound of her world collapsing. Emma's strangled sob cut through the chaos as Aurora, somehow understanding the gravity of the moment, pressed against Dorothy's legs with a low whimper that sounded heartbreakingly human. "No!" Emma screamed, lunging toward Aurora's transport cage as federal marshals moved to secure it. "You can't take her. She didn't do anything wrong." Dorothy caught her granddaughter's trembling form, both of them watching helplessly as Aurora was loaded onto a government transport vehicle. The bear's dark eyes found theirs through the cage bars, and Dorothy swore she saw resignation there, a terrible acceptance that made her chest tighten with anguish. Dr. Blackwood approached them as the media circus swirled around the courthouse steps. "Mrs. Henderson, I want you to know that Aurora will be treated humanely. We're not monsters. She'll have comfortable quarters, the best veterinary care, and her sacrifice will save thousands of lives." "Sacrifice," Dorothy repeated bitterly. "Such a clean word for murder." "It's not murder when it serves the greater good," Blackwood replied, but his eyes couldn't quite meet hers. "Katie has taken a turn for the worse. The doctors say she has weeks, maybe days. Aurora's compounds could give my daughter the chance she deserves." Dorothy saw through his justification to the desperate father underneath, but it didn't soften her anger. And what chance did Aurora deserve? "What choice did you give her?" The drive back to Fairbanks felt like a funeral procession. Emma stared out the window in silence, tears streaming down her pale cheeks while Dorothy gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles. The cabin that had felt like home again now loomed ahead like an empty tomb, every room echoing with Aurora's absence. Jim had flown back to Denver immediately after the verdict, avoiding any conversation about his testimony or its consequences. He'd left legal documents about Sunset Manor on Dorothy's kitchen table, along with a note that read, "Mom, this is for your own good. I'll call next week to discuss arrangements." That first night without Aurora, Emma collapsed in the living room where the bear used to sleep, sobbing with an intensity that terrified Dorothy. The girl's grief seemed to go beyond normal attachment. She was mourning Aurora like a family member, like a sister, like a part of her own soul. "She trusted us," Emma wept, her voice muffled by the blanket that still smelled like Aurora's fur. "She came to us for help, and we let them take her away. We failed her, Grandma. We failed her." Dorothy knelt beside her granddaughter, her own tears falling freely for the first time since the trial began. "We fought for her, baby girl. We fought as hard as we could." "It wasn't enough," Emma whispered. "It's never enough." The media attention that followed was relentless and cruel. Reporters camped outside their property, calling Dorothy everything from selfish grandmother to enemy of medical progress. Social media exploded with debates about her decision, with hashtags like #selfish trending alongside photos of dying children. Death threats arrived in their mailbox, mixed with hate mail from families whose children were fighting cancer. But the cruelest blow came 3 days after the verdict, when Dorothy received a package from PharmaCorp. Inside was a DVD labeled Aurora Research Documentation Day 1, along with a note from Dr. Blackwood. "I thought you might want to see that she's being treated well." Dorothy's hands shook as she inserted the DVD. The footage showed Aurora in a sterile laboratory environment, confused and frightened, pacing in a small enclosure while researchers in hazmat suits observed her behavior. The bear kept looking toward the camera as if searching for familiar faces, and Dorothy could see the fear in those intelligent dark eyes. Emma found Dorothy sobbing in front of the television screen, the DVD playing Aurora's distressed vocalizations on endless loop. "Turn it off," Emma pleaded, but Dorothy couldn't look away from Aurora's obvious suffering. "They promised she'd be comfortable," Dorothy whispered. "They promised she wouldn't suffer." "They lied," Emma said with bitter wisdom beyond her years. Adults always lie when they want something. The second DVD arrived a week later, showing Aurora's condition had deteriorated rapidly. The bear had stopped eating, stopped interacting with researchers, and spent most of her time huddled in the corner of her enclosure. The footage showed her repeatedly scratching at the walls, making sounds that reminded Dorothy of the whimpers Aurora had made when she first appeared on their porch. Desperate, frightened, calling for help that wouldn't come. "She's dying of a broken heart," Emma observed with devastating accuracy. "Just like we are." Dorothy's own health began to decline under the weight of grief and public scrutiny. She stopped eating regular meals, lost weight, and found herself staring out the window for hours, waiting for Aurora to come scratching at the door again. The cabin felt cursed by emptiness, every corner holding memories of the brief period when they'd been happy together. Emma's condition worsened too, though Dorothy was too lost in her own despair to notice the warning signs. Her granddaughter slept constantly, barely had energy for basic activities, and complained of frequent headaches that Dorothy attributed to stress and grief. When Emma fainted while doing laundry, Dorothy finally called Dr. Martinez for a house call. The blood test results arrived on the same day as the third DVD from PharmaCorp. This one showed Aurora barely moving, her thick coat dull and patchy, her eyes vacant with depression. But it was the news from Dr. Martinez that truly shattered what remained of Dorothy's world. "Dorothy, I need you to sit down," Dr. Martinez said gently, her face grave with professional sympathy. "Emma's blood work shows abnormal white cell counts, enlarged lymph nodes, and other markers that suggest leukemia. We need to get her to Anchorage General immediately for more comprehensive testing." The irony struck Dorothy like a physical blow. Aurora, who could potentially cure cancer, had been taken away just as cancer was potentially claiming Emma. The universe seemed determined to extract the cruelest possible price for their brief happiness. Emma took the news with a calm that frightened Dorothy more than hysteria would have. "It's okay, Grandma," she said softly, her young face already showing the gray pallor Dorothy recognized from her nursing days. "At least Aurora won't have to watch me get sick. At least she won't have to feel guilty about not being able to save me." That night, Dorothy sat in Frank's workshop surrounded by his research notes, searching desperately for some clue, some solution that might save both Emma and Aurora. She found references to synthetic compounds, alternative research methods, ways to study Aurora's biology without sacrificing her life. Frank had been working on humane alternatives before his death, but his research was incomplete, theoretical, years away from practical application. And as dawn broke over the Alaskan wilderness, Dorothy made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She couldn't save Aurora through legal channels, couldn't change the court's verdict or PharmaCorp's research protocols. But she could try one last desperate gambit to reunite their broken family, even if it meant risking everything she had left. Emma found her in the kitchen, packing supplies into hiking backpacks. "Grandma, what are you doing?" "Something your grandfather would understand," Dorothy said, her voice steady for the first time in weeks. "Something that might get us all killed, or might save us all. Either way, we're going to be together when we face it." Outside, snow was falling again, and Dorothy wondered if they were about to embark on their final adventure together, or if they might somehow find a way to bring Aurora home where she belonged. The PharmaCorp research facility outside Anchorage looked like a fortress in the pre-dawn darkness, all concrete walls and security cameras sweeping the perimeter with mechanical precision. Dorothy crouched behind a snow-covered pine tree with Emma, both of them shivering in the November cold, watching the guards make their rounds. This was insanity, Dorothy knew. A 68-year-old woman and a sick teenager attempting to break into a federal research facility. But the alternative was watching both Emma and Aurora die while she sat helplessly at home. "Grandma, are you sure about this?" Emma whispered, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The girl looked frailer than ever, the leukemia already beginning to steal her strength, but her eyes burned with determination. "Baby girl, I've never been sure about anything in my life," Dorothy replied, checking the bolt cutters she'd borrowed from Frank's workshop. "But sometimes you have to choose between certain failure and impossible hope." The security footage from Dr. Chen had been invaluable. Sarah had risked her career to smuggle out building schematics and guard schedules, horrified by what she'd witnessed during her own visits to Aurora. The bear was dying, Chen reported, not from disease or injury, but from despair so profound it was shutting down her biological systems. The researchers were baffled. They'd never seen an animal literally die from grief. Dorothy's plan was desperate but simple. The loading dock opened at 5 a.m. for morning deliveries. She and Emma would slip inside during shift change, locate Aurora in the research wing, and somehow get her out. How they'd transport a 200-pound bear without a vehicle, Dorothy hadn't quite figured out. Details, she told herself. They'd work out the details as they went. What Dorothy hadn't expected was the voice that called out from behind them as they approached the fence. "Mrs. Henderson, what the hell are you doing here?" Dorothy spun around to find Dr. Blackwood emerging from the shadows, but he wasn't wearing his usual expensive suit. Instead, he was dressed in dark clothing, carrying what looked suspiciously like his own set of bolt cutters. "I could ask you the same question, Doctor," Dorothy replied, her heart hammering but her voice steady. Blackwood's face was haggard, aged years in the few weeks since the trial. "Katie died yesterday morning," he said quietly, the words dropping like stones into the frozen silence. "The treatments didn't work. None of it worked. And Aurora is dying too." Emma gasped, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Katie's dead?" "Acute organ failure. The experimental treatments I pushed for damaged her liver beyond repair. Blackwood's voice cracked with anguish. I killed my own daughter trying to save her. And now I'm about to kill Aurora for nothing. Dorothy felt an unexpected surge of sympathy for the man who'd destroyed their lives in court. Grief made people do terrible things, she knew. It made them justify the unjustifiable, sacrifice everything good in pursuit of impossible salvation. So, what are you doing here? Dorothy asked. Same thing you are, I suspect. Trying to make something right out of all this wrong. Blackwood held up a key card. I have clearance. You don't have to cut the fence. The three of them moved through the facility like ghosts, Blackwood's key card opening doors that would have been impossible barriers for Dorothy and Emma. The research wing was eerily quiet, fluorescent lights humming over empty corridors that smelled of disinfectant and despair. Aurora's enclosure was at the end of the hall, behind reinforced glass that allowed observation but prevented contact. When Dorothy first saw her, she nearly cried out in anguish. The magnificent bear who'd brought joy back into their lives was barely recognizable, thin, listless, her coat patchy and dull. Aurora lay in the corner of her sterile cage, not even lifting her head when the lights came on. Aurora, Emma whispered, pressing her hands against the glass. Oh, Aurora, what have they done to you? At the sound of Emma's voice, Aurora's head lifted slowly. For a moment, Dorothy thought the bear might not recognize them. Then, Aurora's eyes widened, and she struggled to her feet, rushing to the glass barrier with renewed energy. She pressed her massive paws against the barrier, making soft, whimpering sounds that broke Dorothy's heart. I can get her out, Blackwood said, his fingers flying over the electronic lock. But once this door opens, alarms will sound. We'll have maybe 10 minutes before security arrives. Then we'd better move fast, Dorothy said. The moment the enclosure door clicked open, Aurora burst through and threw herself at Emma with desperate joy. The bear's enthusiasm nearly knocked the frail girl over, but Emma laughed through her tears, wrapping her arms around Aurora's neck as the bear nuzzled her face with careful gentleness. I missed you so much, Emma sobbed into Aurora's fur. I'm sorry we let them take you. I'm so sorry. Dorothy knelt beside them, one hand on her granddaughter, one on Aurora, feeling for the first time in weeks that something essential had been restored to the world. Aurora was thin and weak but alive, and the intelligence in her dark eyes was unchanged. Blackwood stood watching their reunion with something like wonder. She really does love you, he said quietly. I've never seen an animal respond to humans like that. Alarms began wailing throughout the building, red lights flashing as automated voices announced a security breach. Dorothy hauled Emma to her feet while Aurora instinctively positioned herself between the humans and potential threats. This way, Blackwood shouted over the alarms, leading them down a service corridor toward what Dorothy hoped was freedom. They burst through an emergency exit into the parking lot just as security vehicles converged on the building from multiple directions. Dorothy expected Blackwood to abandon them now that his part was done, but instead he opened the doors of a white van parked nearby. Get in, he ordered. All of you. Why are you helping us? Dorothy demanded, even as she helped Emma and Aurora into the vehicle. Because Katie's last words to me were about the bear she'd seen on the news, Blackwood said, his voice breaking. She said Aurora looked sad and she hoped someone would take care of her. My daughter spent her last breath worrying about an animal she'd never met. How can I honor that memory by letting Aurora die in a cage? As they drove through the dawn-lit streets of Anchorage, Dorothy realized their problems were far from over. They were now fugitives, having committed federal crimes by breaking Aurora out of government custody. Law enforcement would be looking for them, and they had nowhere safe to run. But in the back of the van, Emma was curled against Aurora's warm bulk, both of them sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks. And for the moment, that was enough. "Where can we go?" Dorothy asked Blackwood as they headed out of the city. "I have a cabin in the Kenai Peninsula," he replied. "Remote, off the grid. We can hide there while we figure out what to do next." Dorothy studied the man who'd been their enemy just hours before. "What changed your mind? Really?" Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "When Katie died, I went a little crazy. I broke into the research lab, planning to destroy everything, Aurora, the data, all of it. If I couldn't save my daughter, I didn't want to save anyone else's children either." "But you didn't." "No. I found Aurora first, and she was dying, literally dying from grief. And I realized," Blackwood's voice caught, "I realized I'd become the very thing that killed my daughter. Not cancer, me, my obsession, my willingness to sacrifice anything and anyone for results." They drove in silence through the Alaskan wilderness, three unlikely allies bound together by loss and the desperate hope that love might still triumph over the machinery of institutional power. Aurora slept peacefully in Emma's arms, and Dorothy dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, they might find a way to stay together. But she knew the hardest part was still ahead. They'd rescued Aurora from her cage, but they couldn't run forever. Sooner or later, they'd have to face the consequences of choosing love over law, hope over despair. For now, though, they were together. And sometimes, Dorothy thought, that had to be enough. 6 months later, Dorothy stood on the deck of Dr. Blackwood's remote cabin, watching Emma and Aurora play in the morning sunlight that filtered through towering Sitka spruce trees. The sight would have seemed impossible during those dark November days when they'd been fugitives hiding in the wilderness. But sometimes miracles arrived disguised as ordinary moments. Emma looked healthy, truly healthy, for the first time since her leukemia diagnosis. Her cheeks were pink with mountain air, her hair thick and glossy, her energy boundless as she chased Aurora through the meadow behind the cabin. The bear had regained her weight and vitality, her coat once again lustrous and full, but more importantly, the light had returned to her intelligent dark eyes. "It's still hard to believe," said Dr. Sarah Chen, joining Dorothy on the deck with 2 cups of coffee. Sarah had become their unlikely ally during those desperate months of hiding, smuggling medical supplies, and maintaining Emma's treatment while federal authorities searched for their whereabouts. "Which part?" Dorothy asked with a smile. "That we're not in federal prison, or that Emma's completely cancer-free?" "All of it," Sarah laughed. "But mostly that Richard Blackwood turned out to be the hero of this story." Inside the cabin, Blackwood was hunched over his laptop at the kitchen table, video conferencing with researchers around the world about the breakthrough that had changed everything. 3 months into their exile, he'd made a discovery that revolutionized their understanding of Aurora's unique biology. The bear's healing properties weren't locked away in her blood or tissue. They were transmitted through close physical contact, through the mysterious bond she formed with those she loved. Emma's recovery had been the proof they needed. Living with Aurora daily, sleeping curled against her warm fur, spending hours in physical contact with the bear, Emma's leukemia had gone into complete remission without traditional medical intervention. Her white cell counts normalized, her energy returned, and most remarkably, her body showed no trace of the disease that should have killed her. "The FDA approved our research proposal yesterday," Blackwood called from the kitchen, his voice carrying the excitement of a man who'd found redemption in science rather than revenge. "The Aurora protocol is officially recognized as a legitimate treatment option for pediatric cancer patients." Dorothy felt tears prick her eyes. The Aurora protocol what they'd named the Revolutionary Treatment Program, based on supervised interaction between cancer patients and Aurora herself. Instead of killing Aurora to extract her healing properties, they'd developed a program that allowed sick children to spend time with the bear under medical supervision, experiencing healing through the same mysterious connection that had saved Emma. Jim's voice carried from the cabin's interior as he finished a phone call with yet another family seeking treatment for their child. Dorothy's son had undergone his own transformation during these months, abandoning his corporate law practice to become the legal coordinator for their new foundation. The crisis had stripped away his professional armor, revealing the caring man Frank had raised beneath all that ambition and fear. "That was the Martinez family from Phoenix," Jim announced, joining the group on the deck. "Their daughter Sophia has acute lymphoblastic leukemia, same type Emma had. They're flying up next week." Emma looked up from her play with Aurora, her face glowing with purpose. "Sophia's the same age I was when I got sick. Aurora will take good care of her." Over the past month, 12 children had participated in the Aurora Protocol pilot program. 11 of them showed significant improvement in their condition, with 6 achieving complete remission. The one child who hadn't responded, a little boy named Marcus with advanced brain cancer, had still benefited from Aurora's presence, experiencing his final weeks with less pain and more peace than anyone had thought possible. The cabin had been transformed into an unofficial treatment center, with families camping nearby in RVs and tents, creating a temporary community united by hope and healing. Aurora seemed to understand her role, spending patient hours with each child, somehow knowing how much contact each one needed, when to be gentle and when to be playful. "The medical establishment still doesn't understand how it works," Blackwood mused, watching Aurora demonstrate unusual intelligence by opening a complicated puzzle box Emma had built for her. "Her presence somehow boosts immune function, promotes cellular repair, even appears to trigger psychological healing alongside physical recovery." Dorothy had stopped trying to explain Aurora's abilities in scientific terms. Some things transcended measurement and analysis. Love, she'd learned, was the most powerful medicine of all, not the sentimental greeting card version of love, but the deep, transformative force that connected living beings across species boundaries. The morning's peace was interrupted by the sound of helicopters approaching from the south. Dorothy's heart clenched with familiar fear. For months, that sound had meant federal agents, media attention, or other threats to their fragile sanctuary. But these helicopters bore the insignia of the Alaska National Guard, and they landed in the meadow with official precision. Governor Patricia Wells stepped out of the lead helicopter, followed by what appeared to be a delegation of state officials and media representatives. Dorothy had been expecting this visit since news of the Aurora Protocol's success had gone national, but she still felt nervous as the governor approached with her entourage. "Mrs. Henderson," Governor Wells said warmly, extending her hand, "I'm here to present you with the Alaska Medal of Heroism for your contributions to medical research and child welfare." The ceremony that followed felt surreal to Dorothy. Standing in the mountain meadow where they'd found refuge, surrounded by cameras and officials, she accepted recognition for what had felt like the most desperate decision of her life. Aurora sat calmly beside her throughout the proceedings, wearing a specially designed harness that identified her as an official therapy animal. Mrs. Henderson's courage in protecting Aurora ultimately saved countless lives, Governor Wells announced to the assembled crowd. The Aurora Protocol represents a new frontier in medical treatment, and it exists because one grandmother refused to let fear override love. Emma stepped forward during the ceremony, no longer the broken, depressed teenager who'd arrived at Dorothy's cabin months ago. Now 17 and healthy, she'd become an advocate for other young cancer patients, using her experience to guide new families through the treatment process. My grandmother taught me that sometimes the right choice looks impossible until you have the courage to make it, Emma said, her voice strong and clear. Aurora didn't just save my life. She saved all of us. She taught us that healing isn't just about medicine. It's about connection, about love that doesn't give up. As the official ceremonies concluded and the helicopters departed, Dorothy found herself alone with Aurora on the deck as the sun set behind the mountains. The bear had grown larger over their months together, nearly 300 pounds of muscle and fur, but she still approached Dorothy with the same gentle reverence she'd shown that first morning on the cabin porch. "You know what you did, don't you?" Dorothy murmured, scratching behind Aurora's ears in the spot that made the bear close her eyes with contentment. "You saved us all, just by being exactly who you were meant to be." Frank's presence felt strong in the evening air, and Dorothy imagined he was proud of the choice she'd made to protect his final gift. Aurora had been more than a research subject or even a beloved pet. She'd been a bridge between species, a living reminder that love could transcend every boundary humans created. The Aurora Foundation, established with Blackwood's resources and Jim's legal expertise, now operated facilities in 3 states, with more planned as funding became available. Aurora herself would never be subjected to invasive research again, protected by federal legislation that Emma had helped draft. She would spend her life doing what she did best, healing hearts and bodies through the simple act of being present for those who needed her most. As winter approached the Kenai Peninsula, Dorothy realized she'd found something she'd never expected at 68 years old, a new purpose that felt bigger than herself. Emma had decided to defer college for a year to work with the foundation. Jim had permanently relocated to Alaska, and even Blackwood had become like family, united by their shared commitment to Aurora's mission. "You ready for another group of kids next week?" Dorothy asked Aurora, who responded with a soft huffing sound that Dorothy had learned indicated contentment. And the bear's dark eyes reflected the last light of sunset, still filled with the same intelligence and compassion that had first captured Dorothy's heart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families seeking hope, new opportunities to prove that love was indeed the most powerful force in the universe. Dorothy Henderson, who'd once believed her useful life was over, now knew it had only just begun. And all because a desperate frozen bear cub had scratched at her door one October morning, teaching her that sometimes salvation arrived exactly when you'd given up hope of finding it. Aurora pressed her massive head against Dorothy's shoulder in a gesture that had become their evening ritual, and Dorothy understood that some bonds transcended species, circumstances, and even death itself. They were family now, all of them, connected by the miracle of unconditional love that had transformed tragedy into triumph, despair into hope, and loneliness into the richest kind of belonging. At 68, Dorothy Henderson thought her days of being needed were over. After losing her husband and watching her son drift away into his busy life, she'd resigned herself to the quiet loneliness that seems to claim so many of us in our golden years. But sometimes life has other plans. When a desperate, half-frozen bear cub appeared at her door, Dorothy discovered something profound. Our capacity to love and be loved doesn't diminish with age, it deepens. Through Aurora's healing presence and Emma's renewed joy, Dorothy learned that the emptiness we feel after loss isn't an ending, it's space waiting to be filled with new purpose. Her courage to choose love over fear not only saved Aurora and Emma, but created a legacy that would heal countless families. Dorothy's story reminds us that at any age we can be someone's hero, someone's hope, someone's reason to keep going. The most meaningful chapters of our lives might still be unwritten, waiting for us to have the courage to open our hearts one more time. Sometimes our greatest adventure begins not with what we achieve, but with whom we choose to love unconditionally. What moment in your life made you realize you still had more love to give than you thought? Have you ever discovered unexpected purpose during a time when you felt forgotten or overlooked? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.